General, many people would think that as a fighter pilot, you're out on your own, so to speak, and you take care of yourself and your responsibilities. But in terms of leadership, you don't have a lot of responsibility there for men and equipment and resources. Your occupation role and your responsibilities that you just discussed with us seem to give you an opportunity to exercise leadership. Was this your first opportunity to exercise leadership in a military setting?
No, not really. There was a whole new dimension of leadership involved in being involved as a staff officer, of course, in theater headquarters in an occupation situation, a whole new dimension that I'll mention in a minute. But there was a lot of leadership involved in the years, even as a fighter pilot. Not necessarily as an individual fighter pilot who was flying a wing on someone else. But I and others who survived the succession of missions moved up fairly rapidly to command flights, to command the squadron. And it was not particularly apparent at the time to me, but the importance of the leadership, the person who was leader, particularly of a squadron, and how he acted and operated had a tremendous effect on the effectiveness of that squadron. Even within the group that we were in, with 3 squadrons, it was quite apparent that the 2 of the squadrons were in effect head and shoulders above a third one. And as I say, as quite a young officer, very much concerned with just flying and being a fighter pilot, I was not, early on at least, particularly attuned to this problem. But the group commander found it necessary to put in a new squadron commander in one of the squadrons to improve the situation. Without dwelling on it in great detail, the point I'm making is that the impact of a leader and what he does, what he believes in, how he operates, how he interacts with people under his command, have a tremendous effect on the effectiveness of that unit. Its morale, its attitudes, its dedication, its ability to accomplish its mission. And with a strong leader exercising the attributes of leadership that are motivational, can create a highly effective organization. And so I had learned those elements of leadership, even as a fighter pilot, progressing up through the structure of a World War II fighter group. In my assignment in the theater headquarters, it was a whole new role. I was a staff officer, and I became introduced to a whole new culture, if you will, of the Army.
How did you like that culture?
Oh, it was different. It was educational. It was interesting. I enjoyed it. But the one element of the culture that I was introduced to was the GHQ Corps. There was a shield that officers of that corps
General
wore.
Headquarters, is that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some scholar of military heraldry and the corps of the Army may quarrel with me in detail, but there was a segment of the Army officer corps who had been schooled and disciplined and trained to be the administrators. And I remember the GHQ symbol as one of the badges of that group. And so I then became an expert as a staff officer in writing staff studies, And that was a important piece of my education. General Eisenhower's Chief of Staff insisted that any matter important enough for him, much less the commanding general, had to be boiled down to one page. And whatever the problem or issue was that required a decision, had to be boiled down in one page, state the problem, what the facts were that bore on the problem, what the alternatives for solution was, and what we as his staff recommended the action be. And it had to be on one piece of paper and very clear. And of course, we learned all kinds of techniques to comply with that, like putting on all sorts of tabs, and if the thing could be thick. He didn't specify how thick it could be. It just had to be, the message was on one page. But that was good experience for me. And we were involved with such a wide range of issues. Foreign currency was one that I remember being a big issue that fell in my sphere. And the solution to that was to set up a system of script where the indigenous currency, the German mark, was taboo for Army troops. U.S. currency was taboo. So we set up a system of script, including little bills that were nickels and dimes and so on. And of course, in that immediate post-war period, there were tremendous sums of money floating around, not necessarily at the troop level, but at so international currency control was an important factor.
Now, that was later to cause problems with the Soviet part of that quadripartite, I know in Berlin. Did you ever sense at your level, at the GHQ level, a departure from the Western Allies, between the Soviets and the Western Allies?
A departure, meaning a difference of opinion?
Difference of opinion?
Well, yes, it was even in the very early period of the occupation, the extreme sensitivity of any interface or interaction with the Russians or the Russian sector became more and more apparent. Much less so with the British and French. But the rigor of setting up air corridors and of establishing the borders very clearly, setting up the rules for where troops could or couldn't go. It was quite apparent from quite early in the occupation that there was an extreme sensitivity and special attention requirement to the Russian interest in sector.
Your responsibilities had to do with the morale of the troops. Let me ask you about the morale of then, what was it, Captain, Major?
Major.
Major Phillips at the time. You were without family then?
Initially, of course, but I mentioned that troop morale, we were working on a number of programs to enhance morale. One of the activities that we paid attention to early was bringing dependents over. And it turned out that the principal officer responsible for that project was the other major. I mentioned there were two of us as P-38 fighter pilots assigned there in G1. That officer was Major Robert McDermott, who later was the superintendent of faculty at the Air Force Academy and currently is the president and CEO of USAA, major insurance company. But that project involved establishing the infrastructure and the processes by which wives and children, families of occupation forces could be brought into Germany and establish family life. Frankfurt as a city had been largely destroyed during the war. The IG Farben building, which was the theater headquarters, had some damage, but largely was intact and was used as the headquarters building. There were limited areas in of apartments in that general area that were repairable, and so there in Frankfurt, a particular area was set up and established and refurbished as family apartments. So by early '46 then, this now clearly being only a few months after the war ended, the first Army troop transports were bringing dependents over. My family, which consisted by then of a wife and a very small daughter, was on the second ship, as I recall. And so we set up an apartment there in Frankfurt and managed rather quickly to adapt to family life in occupied Germany.
But you weren't to stay there too long before you were picked up for assignment back in the States. How did your past assignments, your past activities play in that assignment process, do you think?
Well, in the summer of 1947, I received orders transferring me to Langley Air Force Base for duty with the 1st Airways and Air Communications Service Wing. I might just parenthetically add that this transfer was almost concurrently with the establishment of the U.S. Air Force.
I was in...
The Defense Act of 1947 established the structure of the Department of Defense and carved the U.S. Air Force out of the Army, its basic cadre being the Army Air Corps. So all of us who were members of the Army Air Corps were given opportunity to either stay in the Army or to be transferred to the newly established U.S. Air Force. Being very interested in flying and highly motivated air officer, there was no question for me. It was automatic transfer to the newly established U.S. Air Force.
Now, did you ever question whether you might return to civilian life? Many were doing that at the time, even regular officers.
Yes, I did. That period in 1947 was one of the obvious points at which to seriously consider whether to stay in or get out. I'd had a very satisfactory career so far, was very interested in flying. I could see opportunities in the U.S. Air Force for pursuing technical lines that were very much of interest to me.
As an engineer, you wanted to combine both then?
Yes. So you asked about my assignment out of Germany. Clearly, the personnel system did pay attention to education and at least the education element of background, because here, as a fighter pilot, now in a theater headquarters staff position, I was assigned to a highly technical organization, the Airways and Air Communications Service. The AACS was the forerunner of what is in today's Air Force, the Air Force Communication Service. In the post-war years, the late 40s and into the 50s, the AACS was a worldwide organization. It had a wing responsible for continental U.S. activities, other wings in Europe and in the Far East. And the mission of the AACS was to operate all of the navigation aids and flying support facilities required for the Air Force. That meant control towers, ground control approaches, GCA, the installation and maintenance of instrument landing systems, the airways communication system, intercommunication with the weather service, and so I was pleased to be assigned to AACS and asked to be assigned in the operations part. My experience to then had caused me to want to be involved in the planning and operations side of the things as opposed to the logistics and maintenance at that stage. So so I was involved in the planning and the conduct of the operations of the AACS here in the U.S., the establishment of control towers and the setting up the programs to train the operators. The big new thing in that period was GCA, ground controlled approach. And so we had a major activity to equip U.S. Air Force bases with GCAs and to train the operators and perfect the skills. We were also involved with many other navigation aids and interaction with the civil authorities because, of course, the Army or the Air Force's system was compatible with and interoperable with the civil system of navigation aids and airways.
So you did combine then a good interest in flying and electronics,
Yes.
technology. What about education? Did you feel a need for greater education at this time?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I became interested in possibilities for advanced education while I was still in Germany in the theater headquarters. I mentioned that we were setting up training programs and so on for the troops. And so the Army, I think undoubtedly motivated to some extent by the requirement to offer education as one of the aspects of troop morale there in Germany, had set up some pretty innovative programs. It was of education opportunities. And so I started to become aware of the possibilities of further education as I was involved as a staff officer in those activities. With the creation of the U.S. Air Force, I think the new Air Force took a very, very enlightened approach to the question of advanced education for its personnel. And quite early on, the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright Field, AFIT, which exists in a somewhat further developed form even today, had existed for some time in the Army Air Corps at Wright Field. And it became the focal point then for the new U.S. Air Force's planning and efforts to expand education opportunities for officers in particular, but also for enlisted non-commissioned personnel. And even in the 40s still, with the tremendous thrust that it was already apparent of technology influencing military capabilities, which is a reminder that General Hap Arnold, who was responsible for the Air Corps during the war years, was a very strong proponent of the attention to technical scientific matters as being a vital requirement for a capable and progressive air capability. So General Hap Arnold started the interest in, and then what I think of as enlightened attention to the requirement for technical education. So the Air Force set up, among other things, a course at the University of Michigan to train people in the graduate level disciplines involved in guided missiles, involving electronics, propulsion, instrumentation. And I was fortunate to be, well, first of all, I made the application to the Air Force Institute of Technology for graduate education, and was selected to attend the University of Michigan well, by then was, or in that period, became called electronics. So I then went through Michigan in a year and a half, from the summer of 1948 to January of 1950, to a graduate degree in electronics at Michigan. It was in that period that the transistor was invented at Bell Laboratories, and so I had an opportunity to be at the university when that news came on the scene, and learn a little bit more then about what later became solid-state electronics. The academic world in that period was exploiting heavily the work of the radiation laboratory at MIT, which had been developing radar during World War II. And one of the set of texts that was used there in Michigan were the radiation laboratory series out of MIT. As I look back on it, it was a pretty concentrated course. I used the summer session, June to September, as a refresher, because I'd been out of college for a few years and hadn't studied for a while. So I had to get back into things like mathematics and calculus and physics. I wondered a time or two whether I was going to make it, and that old age state.
Well, you did indeed make it, and it was to change your career rather dramatically, wasn't it?
Yes. I was assigned, when I graduated with a master's in electronics from Michigan, to Wright Field, which is where I wanted to go. In that period, the Air Materiel Command was the major command of the young U.S. Air Force, responsible for all aspects of Air Force research, development, procurement, production, logistics, maintenance, depots, the works. It was the single command. I was assigned in the engineering division of AMC, and was assigned in one of the laboratories, which was responsible for the radio guidance of drone airplanes. And so that picked up on what I'd learned at Huntington as a fighter pilot on the Weary Willie. And as a matter of fact, one of my early bosses was a very young engineer who had been responsible for the system engineering on the Weary Willie. He was very young even then, but a man named Pete Murray, who later, when I was commander of AFSC, was my director of laboratories, incidentally. But so the job that I went into, which was very exciting, had the responsibility for the radio remote control of airplanes that were being prepared for use in the nuclear tests in the Pacific at Bikini and Eniwetok. The airplanes that were involved were in the program were B-17s, both drones and directors. The it was quite new at the time, P-80, the first of the truly operational U.S. Air Force fighter jets. And by then, the T-33, which was a two-seat version of the P-80, had appeared on the scene. So the T-33s were being prepared as directors for the P-80s as drones. And the purpose of the B-17s and P-80s planned for the nuclear tests in the Pacific was to position them at various points relative to the atomic burst to obtain data on the effects of the explosion on airplanes to be used for designing airplanes, and to fly through the nuclear debris and clouds to obtain samples for the scientists that were involved in the nuclear developments. So I was, as a major still, a project engineer. It was really I guess the single assignment in my career where I was truly a hands-on project engineer. And we were responsible for designing, developing, testing, building these drones and directors to be turned over to an operating unit that was based at Eglin, which then did the training and set up all the operating modes for deployment over to the Pacific and the conduct of the actual operation. I was able, in working with the operating organization, to identify one of the weak points in the system, which was a single point failure, which if the radio receiver failed, that the drone would be lost. And that was a concern to them, and we worked it together. And so I set out to design an emergency system then. It amounted to taking a second receiver, setting up a form of fairly elementary controls that could then save the airplane. So this was the emergency system that was put on the drones. Well, I mentioned that only in that it was satisfying as a technical project engineer, just graduated from a university. And although over decades following, I was very much involved in highly technical matters, I think, to be honest, that's the only time I ever actually designed the details and supervised the fabrication and testing of what I considered to be a rather innovative technical article.
Was it during this time that you became involved in the Strategic Air Command? And
No, that came later.
Mm-hmm.
I accompanied the airplanes out to Eniwetok, and this was for about 6 months, from early '51 on into the summer, for the tests of Project Greenhouse. And we, in those tests, obtained an awful lot of information that was important for the design of aircraft to be effective in a nuclear environment: overpressure, thermal, light, crew protection, and radiation protection, and so on. We learned a lot about the effects of the nuclear blast on electronics. That was a hard lesson that we learned because it disrupted our telemetry rather badly for our drone airplanes. That was the period in which I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. I haven't particularly gone back and looked at my record of rank, but I think I was a major longer than any other rank.
Were you promoted below the zone at any one time?
Well, in World War II, certainly, but then later to colonel and the general ranks, the answer is yes. After Project Greenhouse, I was assigned to the Armament Laboratory, initially responsible for what was called the Bomber Defense Organization, which meant responsibility for the armament systems to defend bombers. That amounted to turrets and fire control. The big thrust in that period was the B-36 bomber. This was the Convair big airplane in the late 40s, 6 pusher engines and ultimately 4 jets out on the wingtips, a 10-engine airplane. It had fire control, it had turrets located on top and the belly and the tail and the sides. It was a flying fortress, truly. But the armament principally was 20-millimeter cannons, the same one really that we'd had in our P-38 in World War II. But getting that cannon to be reliable was a nightmare. And the tail turret was equipped with radar, one of the early fire control radars. It was made by General Electric Company. And getting that radar and tail turret fire control system all integrated and working so it was dependable, reliable, and durable was a terrible problem. So I spent endless hours, days, and weeks planning and supervising the effort to make the fire control system on the B-36 dependable and reliable.
And that effort involved contractors.
Oh yes, very much. It involved the airplane contractor, Convair, and the fire control system, Convair, principally General Electric Company, and some of the other armament makers of the time, whose names I've forgotten now.
Hughes was involved in a system at the same time.
Well, that's true. My involvement with Hughes came slightly later when I was assigned responsibility for all operations of the Armament Laboratory, which included another major segment of the lab's activities, which was fighter fire control. And this now in the early 50s, the fighters of the day coming on the scene were the F-86, the F-84, the F-80 was still being developed. The designation had changed from P to F, pursuit to fighter. The beginnings of the Century series were in the competitive stages that became the F-100, the 101, 102. All of those fighters were highly dependent on integrated fire control systems. We were in the beginning stages of guided missiles for fighters. And the Armament Laboratory was involved very much in this. Hughes had most of the contracts for fire control for the fighters of that period. And that involved fire control radars, computers, and the integrated systems for fighter fire control. Hughes also had the Falcon guided missile, which was being designed for carriage on a fighter in 2 versions. One was an infrared seeker, the other was a radar seeker. And of course that was integrated highly with the fire control system. There were problems that were becoming apparent with how Hughes was meeting its commitments to the Air Force in a contractual sense, failing to meet commitments in terms of time and performance, and the idiosyncrasies of Howard Hughes were becoming apparent at the management level. So there was concern in the upper levels of the Air Force and in the Armament Laboratory and in the procurement offices of the Materiel Command with the almost the dominant position that Hughes had in this awfully important field.
Monopolistic, then.
Yes. So actions were undertaken to start developing competitive sources and to start creating commercial interest in developing competing systems. And although others might elaborate on that Hughes story, that's at least the essentials of it.
You were at the forefront of research and development at this time in many areas. What was the Air Force doing to position itself to take advantage of the research that was being done and development that was taking place?
In that period, this now being the early 50s, the Air Force was, I think, doing considerable introspection of whether it was organized properly to provide appropriate emphasis to technological developments and the conversion of those technological developments to operational equipment and systems. The decision of the time then was to create an Air Research and Development Command as a new major command of the Air Force, and to establish to use as its foundation and cadre the engineering division of the Air Materiel Command. So ARDC was created there in the early 50s and was charged with the R&D and the technical side of the Air Force's work. Now, in addition to providing the means by which emphasis could be given to that field, it also created problems because the conversion of research and development to practice in deployed weapon systems required very close work between the engineering component, which now was the Air Research and Development Command, and the procuring component, which was still the Air Materiel Command. So by then I had been reassigned as the what in today's world you would call a program director on the B-52. And I was the ARDC officer. By then I was a colonel, responsible for the development of the B-52. But the procurement of the B-52 as a weapon system to be delivered to the Strategic Air Command was a mission of the Air Materiel Command and its procurement organization. So the way we organized and operated in that period then was to establish JPOs, Joint Program Offices, in which the Air Research and Development Command people would co-locate and work directly with the Air Materiel Command procurement and production people.
On a specific system like the 50?
Yes, on a specific system, and there were, of course, a number of specific systems. So in that period, careful rules were set up and promulgated in Air Force regulations to specify which command had the paramount interest at the different times in the life cycle of a weapon system. And I've forgotten exactly when the responsibility passed from the Air Research and Development Command to the procurement and production of the Air Materiel Command, but it had to do with something of the timing of the turning over to the operating command of the first units, or somewhere in that period. So initially I was the principal responsible agent for the Air Research and Development Command during the engineering and development phase of the B-52, and then later turned that responsibility over to Colonel O'Connor, who was the other half of the of the JPO. responsible for the contracting, procurement, and production of the weapon system. So as I say, the reorganization to establish the Air Research and Development Command certainly did provide the forum in which emphasis on technology and technological developments could be pursued, but it did create the problem of establishing the links and the interaction between the engineering element of the Air Force and the procuring production elements, which we found ways around, like setting up JPOs and rules for their interaction.
You must take some degree of pride in the involvement with the B-52. It's over 20 years since the aircraft was introduced in the inventory. In fact, more than one generation of pilots have been involved in that aircraft.
Well, I do take some pride in that, but it's more than 20. See, we turned the first airplane over to SAC in 1955, as I recall. So that's 34 years, isn't it?
Exactly.
And there's still quite a large number of B-52s in the inventory. I want to make mention briefly of a period I skipped over of my experience there at Wright Field. Between the Armament Laboratory and being the director of the B-52 program, I was in charge of what was called the Fighter Missile Organization, which had responsibility, this being in the engineering division of the Air Materiel Command, for the both ground-launched and air-launched missiles of the day that were for air defense. And that involved the Beaumark, which was a ground-launch ramjet supersonic long-range interceptor. A missile that was called the Talos, which was an adaptation of a Navy ground launch air defense missile. The Falcons that I mentioned, which were the Hughes fighter missiles of the day in development. The Sidewinder, which was adapting the Navy-developed Sidewinder, developed up here at Knott's Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake, which was this now early 50s, and the Sidewinder is one of the principal armaments on today's fighters, as you know. It goes by a name and number that I haven't caught up with in current times. So we were very much involved in a quite an ambitious series of both ground and air-launched missiles of the period. And those missiles, in varying degrees, involved sophisticated propulsion, early steps, I think of them now as early steps in rocket propulsion, and in advanced forms of jet propulsion like ramjets, which the Beaumark depended on. In the, you mentioned Strategic Air Command, and I want to move on to that phase of my career. During the years that I was at Wright Field, all the years really, I interacted very considerably with the young Strategic Air Command. My initial interactions were largely on the B-36. Remember I said when I was assigned to the Armament Lab, initially the big challenge I had was to get the fire control system on the B-36 reliable. And the B-36 was the principal long-range bomber of that period of the Strategic Air Command. And so I spent a lot of time at Carswell, which was one of the B-36 bases, and in Omaha, the headquarters of Strategic Air Command, describing the work being done to correct the problem and interacting with SAC on that. And then, of course, later in the B-52 program, the B-52 being developed entirely for operation by SAC, I got to know the key people in SAC and their mission and operations quite intimately.
Including Curtis LeMay?
Including the great Curtis LeMay, who today is a very good friend and always was a strong critic and a very strong leader and commander who deserves the gratitude of the nation for understanding how to create in the late 40s the strategic force that is SAC. But General LeMay and I didn't always see eye to eye. In that period, of course, he was a four-star general and I was a colonel. I remember one of the key disagreements had to do with whether or not to introduce a new bombing system into the B-52. This was when I was the program director of the B-52. General LeMay had just been through a long period of very difficult, a long, difficult period of unreliability of bombing systems in the B-29, the B-50, the B-47. And he wasn't about to let us engineering people put a new bombing system in his brand new airplane without his being really satisfied that it was sufficiently developed to be reliable, so he wouldn't wind up back in the same problem of bombing systems that didn't work reliably. He was right, but he and I had a interesting meeting along with many supporting staff in a conference room at Omaha back in the middle 50s over introducing what was called the MA2 bombing system into the B-52. It would, among other things, introduce digital computation instead of analog computation to the bombing, the air navigation and target location and ultimately bomb aiming problem. That system, General LeMay was right to put his foot out and say, look, you guys go off and put that in some other airplanes and go fly it for a long time, and when you can prove to me it's ready, we'll come back and see me. Well, we undertook probably a 2 or so year program to really work the details, and it later was introduced into the B-52 and of course is a very fine bombing system.
Sounds as if you learned how to use diplomacy at that point in your career.
Well, I didn't think of it at the time, but that's probably right. At least I needed to know how to engage in a constructive conversation with my superiors over very important matters.
Tell us about the THOR project, your involvement with that, General.
Well, by then I was in the Strategic Air Command and assigned in England to SAC's 7th Air Division, which was headquartered in the western part of London and was responsible within SAC for operating a number of bases there in England, in the UK, which were either staging bases pre or post-strike or for conducting operations out of England by SAC. The ballistic missile program in this country got started in 1954, which was about the time that I was being assigned at Wright Field as the director of the B-52 bomber program. The ballistic missile program under General Schriever out here, established initially as the Western Development Division, later became the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division, started with the Atlas missile, the liquid-fueled Atlas, and shortly started the Titan to involve some alternate technologies of propulsion and guidance and structures and so on. And in that early period, the need for a shorter range missile, the Atlas and Titan were being developed for intercontinental range, 5,000 plus miles. But the need for a shorter range missile, intermediate range, of the order of 1,500 miles was identified. And so the Western Development Division under General Schriever undertook the program that became the THOR, IRBM, Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile. It involved some of the same technologies as were going into the Atlas and the Titan, but being somewhat smaller and of somewhat more limited scope than the Atlas and Titan, they proceeded more rapidly with this development. And by, I've forgotten exactly which year, it was 1957 probably, 57 or 58, the THOR had reached a state of development that the President of the United States then, in one of the international meetings with the head of the United Kingdom government, reached an agreement in principle that the THOR would be deployed on British soil in England to be part of the structure of NATO forces, or deterrent forces opposing the Eastern Bloc and Russia. So with an agreement in principle at the president level, the job of negotiating the details of the agreement was given to the Air Force and delegated rather rapidly, properly, to the 7th Air Division in England, which was commanded by Major General Butch Blanchard, and I was his director of logistics in the 7th Air Division. So General Blanchard and his operations people were involved with the Royal Air Force, who had been given the job of negotiating the agreement, and I was working, interacting with the British component of the Royal Air Force, responsible for planning the installation, maintenance, supply, logistics support, and all the support elements of the THOR. So I was directly involved then in working out the international agreement with the UK for the deployment of the THOR into England. And that moved very, very rapidly. See, I was assigned to SAC in the 7th Air Division in the summer of 1956. By the time I left in the summer of 1959, we had already deployed some number of THORs, had built the first base, and were moving rapidly to equip the Royal Air Force, which would operate the THORs. There were rather extensive agreements required to deal with who was responsible for what elements of construction, because bases had to be prepared and support facilities. Intricate agreements concerning the warheads, rules of employment, the interactions between the forces of the two countries, U.S. and U.K. So it was an important agreement, worked out in considerable detail, implemented very quickly to deploy the new THOR, just really beginning flight testing, to be operational there in England. and was done quite effectively, I might add. Well, it was in that period of 58, early 59, when I was involved as an officer of the 7th Air Division of SAC in the deploying of THORs into England, and therefore working directly not only with the Royal Air Force, but also with the still young Air Force Ballistic Missile Division here in California to work directly with them for the planning and implementation of that deployment.
That was almost a prophetic pairing for you, wasn't it?
So I guess came to the attention of General Schriever, who was commanding the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division. And
let me ask you to go into a little bit more about the selection process there after we change our tape.
all right.
General, it's interesting with your involvement in England and with the Strategic Air Command. A lot of people would have expected you to go on to a job as commanding a wing somewhere in the States, perhaps. That wasn't to be the case. How did it come about that you transitioned into the ballistic program?
My ambitions at the time that I was in the 7th Air Division was to stay in SAC for somewhat longer. And my immediate ambition and objective was to become a wing commander in SAC. And I think that in a different course of events, that probably would have occurred. I'll get to your question of how did I wind up in the Minuteman program momentarily, but I have always believed, and still do, that it's important for an officer to maintain close identification with the mission elements of the Air Force. I started out, of course, as a fighter pilot in a mission-oriented organization. And as my career progressed through some 6 years at Wright Field, I had become very much involved with the research and development and what's today called the acquisition side of the Air Force. And by 1956, which is when I was transferred to SAC, I thought that it was important for me to renew my firsthand involvement with the operating side of the Air Force. So my transfer from Air Research and Development Command to SAC was partly at my initiative. I wanted to get back into the operating side of things. And as my 3-year tour there in the 7th Air Division was drawing to an end, and by then I had become very much involved with the deployment of the THOR, my immediate ambitions were to stay in SAC for a while and to hopefully qualify to move on up in command into a wing command position. Your question was, how did I wind up in the Minuteman program? Well, during the time that I was very much involved with the THOR deployment, I inevitably came to the attention of the people here in the Ballistic Missile Division, and in particular, General Schriever. So General Schriever is the one really to answer your question, but although he and I have talked some in later years, my education was a factor. The fact that I'd been at Wright Field for some years and had demonstrated some experience and proficiency in the research, development, and acquisition side of the business, and then becoming involved through SAC with the THOR deployment, that all kind of added up to my being a candidate for assignment to AFBMD, the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division. And as I say, General Schriever is the one to answer your question about how he made that decision. But I was selected and was ordered then to duty in Englewood as the Minuteman Program Director.
Was it a new program at the time?
Yes, it was a new program. This now is the summer of 1959. So I reported for duty here in Englewood in, I think probably in August of 1959. I was a colonel and was assigned as the program director on the Minuteman. Well, the Minuteman program was new. It had started actually with the signing of contracts for with the industrial participants in October of 1958. So it was 8 or 9 months underway as an active program. It was on a quite an accelerated schedule. The Minuteman was a very bold concept at that time. You visualized the period, this being now the late 50s. The concept involved installing ballistic missiles, solid propellant, in remote control, unattended silos with nuclear warheads, positioned in a position of alert where they could be launched on proper electronic command in a matter of seconds. So that was a very bold concept. It was contrary to the prevailing thinking of the time, if you will. And of course there was properly considerable debate about whether it really made sense. But the purpose of the program was to enable us to acquire rapidly an affordable and effective strategic ballistic missile deterrent force. The Atlas and the Titan that had preceded the Minuteman only by not very long were very, very complex and very costly to operate. They required large numbers of people. So the manpower demands were very, very large for an Atlas squadron or for a Titan squadron. And the early configurations of the Atlas in particular were quite soft, very vulnerable to attack. The Minuteman also was conceived to be housed in underground silos that were protected to a very, very great degree from damage even by nuclear attack. So it brought in also the dimension of survivability through hardness and through dispersal. They were deployed such that a nuclear weapon which might damage one would damage only one. And the planners of the time saw a need for a large force. Large originally was defined as I remember, about 850. And ultimately, of course, there were 1,000 Minuteman missiles that were deployed operationally. And that number remains to this date, except for the few that have been converted to the next generation of ballistic missiles, the Peacekeeper.
How do you think the task of Minuteman, the objective that was originally conceived for it, was carried out? Do you think that you were able to carry that to fruition?
Yes, very definitely. I undoubtedly have some bias in my opinion, but I believe, and I think a large number of others believe, that the Minuteman program was one of the most successful development and operational programs that the Air Force has undertaken really in its whole history.
How do you feel about the way that the politicians use Minuteman and other systems? Do you think that's consistent with the operational capabilities of the systems?
Yes, very definitely. It's important that a military system, particularly a strategic deterrent system, be capable of doing what is described as its operational capability. In other words, it's essential that it be capable of doing that. And furthermore, it's important, and I think essential, that the potential adversary know that that's the case. In other words, it has to be a for real system that for real can accomplish its ultimate military mission if it's required to do so. And the foundation of the doctrine of deterrence that is successfully, I think, prevented a strategic war, major war, on a major international basis ever since World War II has been the doctrine of deterrence, where in our country, with the combination of the intercontinental ballistic missiles, of which the Minuteman has been and is the key element, and the undersea missiles of the Navy, Polaris, Trident, Poseidon series, the long-range manned bomber going back all the way to the B-29s, B-50s, B-36, B-47, B-52, B-1, that line. Each of those components has been developed and perfected to the state that it can, in fact, carry out the military mission for which it's designed. And it's been tested and demonstrated sufficiently that we have every confidence that it can perform as intended. And the other element that I mentioned, the essentiality of an adversary knowing that that's the case, I think is also satisfied. And I think in that perspective, then, the national leaders, politicians, I think have effectively understood that capability and have, I think, effectively used that in their international negotiations to achieve limitations on arms, which I personally think are essential to the equation of international stability and prevention of war. I think I might, in effect, digress a little bit from the question to at least mention that our defense doctrine on a strategic level has now largely been based on an offensive capability since World War II, the doctrine of deterrence through capability to strike and strike back. Our defensive capability in a traditional air defense or strategic defense today is very thin. There have been periods since, excuse me, there have been periods since World War II when there has been more or less in the way of air defense capability. We've been through various stages of that. And although we do have some air defense capability today, largely through the employment, assignment and employment of tactical fighters, and in a realistic sense, we don't have very much in the way of strategic defense. The initiative undertaken in recent years under President Reagan's direction to move in the direction of developing a strategic defensive capability, I personally think is a sound move. I think in a total military equation of strategic level international defenses, that it's necessary to have some balance between offensive capability and defensive capability on both sides. Our largely offensive capability since World War II has very effectively served as a deterrent and a preventer of major war. But I think as the years unfold in the future, and especially because the USSR has followed a doctrine of developing significant defenses in addition to their offenses, and we have not, I think there's an imbalance currently, and that in the larger picture of strategic defense, that it is important that we develop a growing capability to defend against attack either from the air or ultimately from ballistic missiles. Such a defensive capability as a fraction of our total force I think is important. And I think we have to be realistic and recognize that perfect defenses are not in the cards, probably ever. But at the same time, I think we should recognize that we have the technical capacity and capability to provide for defenses in an increasing proportion of our total strategic posture.
A lot of people would suggest that technology is at the base. You certainly have been familiar with technology. You took a technology in an unmanned system and were asked to transition into a manned system, Apollo. How did you become involved in that program, General?
Well, there again, it was a matter not of my initiative, interestingly, but a matter I think of being apparent to the people in NASA. You know, in my years here as the director of the Minuteman Program, which was one of the small number of very top priority national security programs, I became known to a number of people, including a few of the top people in the new National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Recall that NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was created by the Space Act of 1958, and that was a national response, political and otherwise, to the Sputnik accomplishment in October of '57 by the USSR, and to some extent, I guess, was an expression of dissatisfaction by our national leaders with the way in which the United States space programs were progressing. And the action then was to create NASA. NASA was created by picking up or transferring to the new organization two of the major technical components of the Army's ballistic missile effort, one being the group of people and facilities at the Redstone Arsenal, headed by Werner von Braun, with his group that had been brought from Germany and which had been built on then to create a very considerable capability for rocket development.
The Peter Munda group.
Yes, And the other major component that was transferred was JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, which under Caltech was a contractor to the Army, largely the missile organization, and had a very considerable capability in rocketry and in the growing, emerging space activities. So those two components from the Army, one of them being under contract, obviously, JPL, plus the NACA, National Aeronautics Coordinating Committee, which had been created back in the teens of this century to advance the technology of aeronautics, and had built up very capable research facilities at Langley and at Lewis in Cleveland and at Ames here in California, where they'd constructed large wind tunnels and aeronautical research facilities, and played a key role in the development of aeronautical technologies in the period leading up to and through and immediately after World War II. So those three centers of NACA, which the total of NACA, plus the two organizations I mentioned from the Army, constituted the beginnings of NASA. The NASA originally was headed by Keith Clennon, who was the first administrator, and one of his acts was to create one additional center, the one at Goddard, and to charter them with the responsibility for developing certain Earth orbiting satellites. And a little later, and I'll get to my involvement, the establishment or creation of two new centers. The one at Houston, Johnson Space Center, as it's known now, had its beginnings at Langley Research Center in what was known as the Space Task Group. And that Space Task Group had been formed there at Langley in the very early part of NASA's existence to plan and direct and accomplish the first manned program, which was the Mercury program. And the Mercury, which was done under the direction of the Space Task Group at Langley, which incidentally used the Redstone from the Army and then the Atlas from the Air Force as its launch vehicles, then took on the next step of the manned program, which was the Gemini, which used as its launch vehicles the Air Force's Titan. And in that period of the very early 60s, late, I don't know, it was in 59 or so, it was only a year or two after NASA was chartered, that Space Task Group, which had been formed at Langley, then became the beginnings of what became the Manned Spacecraft Center at Houston, which is now known as the Johnson Space Center. And of course, one other new organization was created, which was the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, which took over some of the facilities that the Air Force had built in its ballistic missile programs to be the initial launch facilities for the new NASA. So that kind of sets the stage then for May of 1961, when President Kennedy announced the goal for the nation to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out, which interestingly enough defined the mission for Apollo as well. But that was in May of 1961 now. And NASA arranged, and as I described, was quite a strong and capable technical organization. It was fractionated in the form of its various centers and field elements, and understandably so because of the way it had been formed by taking organizational elements from other organizations and putting them together and building on them. And the national goal stated by President Kennedy of landing men on the moon and returning them to Earth within the decade, which allowed another 8 or so years, was kind of challenging. If you think about it, put yourself back to that point in time. 1962, relatively few flights into space had been made. I think his pronouncement was before Al Shepard's flight. I'd have to check that to be sure, but I think it was certainly
on the
in the same time period as the very first of man's flight into space. So try to think for a minute about how are you going to do that? How are you going to carry that out? So here are tremendously capable technical organizations. Marshall, which the group under von Braun at Huntsville became known as the Marshall Space Flight Center, with obvious tremendous capability for designing, building the very large boosters and rockets. The manned spacecraft people, the Langley Task Force, were in their infancy with Mercury, which was a tiny little Earth-orbiting, short-duration vehicle. So shortly after President Kennedy was elected, he appointed Jim Webb to be the administrator of NASA. So he followed Keith Clennon, who was the first one. Jim Webb accompanied Secretary McNamara, who was the new Secretary of Defense, to a visit out here to Ballistic Missile Division right after the election, right after January of 1961. So as I recall, Secretary McNamara's first visit out here, he had not only his own advisors, which included Dr. Harold Brown as his defense research, DD-ARNI, Director of Defense Research and Engineering, plus others of their staff. As an interesting sidelight, Secretary McNamara's military assistant was General George Brown, who in later years, of course, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But Jim Webb accompanied Mr. McNamara on that trip, and I still remember very well in that, well, it was over on Arbor Vitae, the meeting where the Ballistic Missile Division was briefing Secretary McNamara on our programs, the Atlas, Titan, and Minuteman. So I gave a full briefing on the Minuteman program, which, and we had just days before launched our first missile, Missile 401, the very first Minuteman to fly. I remember that for a number of reasons, one of which is I gave Secretary McNamara a picture, which I signed, that it was a first flight and an unprecedented success. It was an all-up mission. In other words, although it was launched from a surface pad, the missile was complete, and it had all stages, guidance, and a reentry vehicle, and a target out near Ascension Island. And the impact was well within our specifications. So the Minuteman program had reached a stage of flight testing and demonstrated its first flight. We were quite well along with the beginnings of our preparation for manufacturing and our beginnings of designs for construction of sites and for training of people and the whole range of things that had to be done. But in addition, the Minuteman program at that time included a mobile component. The planning of the time contemplated that about a third of the Minuteman force would be deployed on railroad cars as a mobile Minuteman, and two-thirds of the force would be deployed in the hardened and dispersed sites. I mention that because the mobile system had reached a fairly advanced stage of development and, of course, was briefed to Secretary McNamara in that same meeting. And I mention it also because in the current times we're now debating at the national level the deployment of some or all of the Peacekeeper missiles on railroad cars. Here we were in 1961 with, which is 25 years ago, with a mobile system well along in development. Well, I'm wrapping a number of subjects into this comment, but one of the actions that came out of that meeting was a decision the following week by Secretary McNamara to cancel the Mobile Minuteman program as one of several that he canceled as a result of that trip. That trip had covered other places like Wright Field in the course of his being introduced to the important programs of the time. I remember Mobile Minuteman, Skybolt, which was being done at Wright Field, which was an air-launched ballistic missile, was canceled. The Dinosaur, which was to be a manned space plane to be launched on a Titan III, which would have been a 1960s version, small, of what is today's shuttle.
And that was managed
here at Ballistic Missile Division. So I remember those were three of the programs that he canceled. Now, I want to recognize that the president of this great country and his key advisors, including the Secretary of Defense, have in every administration a very difficult challenge to balance the needs of national security, the expenditures that are being made and planned to be made to satisfy those needs with all the other needs of the country. And Secretary McNamara, obviously with the President's blessing, made the judgment that those three programs at least, Mobile Minuteman, Dinosaur, and Skybolt, weren't sufficiently important to the defense structure of that he saw as required at that time to justify the expenditures. So we here, although very disappointed that the program was canceled, had to recognize that the national leaders had to make those kinds of hard decisions, and so we got on with doing the rest of our job. Now, another point that I try to make here is that in the course of that meeting, Jim Webb also was an observer as a guest of Secretary McNamara. So for whatever it was worth, he saw this whole organization in action, including me. And you may remember that during the Mercury program, there was quite a clamor in the country about expressing dissatisfaction with the progress of our manned program. In that same period, the USSR undertook their manned program, and Gagarin turned out to be the first astronaut in space to orbit the Earth. So the Russians beat us while our Mercury program was in progress. And incidentally, there were other firsts that were achieved by the Russians later. So there was a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the progress of our program. And recognize in that same time period now that the President announces the goal to go to the moon. Jim Webb, a new administrator, I think for himself, was able to size up the capabilities of his new organization as having tremendous technical capability, but almost no experience in managing large programs involving multiple government organizations and many large industrial contractors. So as I've been told that Jim Webb went to Secretary McNamara and in effect asked for some help, the assignment of a military officer of experience to direct the Apollo program. So it turned out I was the person selected, and at the end of 1963 then, I was ordered to duty on detached service with National Aeronautics and Space Administration in Washington to head the Apollo program.
And this was not a military organization. Not an organization that had a lot of military people in it at the time. How did you feel about going there? How did they feel about having you come there?
Well, interesting questions all. I guess I find it interesting as I think back that I was not anxious to go. I was, by then, I had been elevated, but only shortly before, from directing the Minuteman Program to being the vice commander of what was then the Ballistic Systems Division.
And your rank at that time, General?
Was Brigadier General, 1 star. And was looking forward to becoming the commander of the Ballistic Systems Division. I should add that shortly prior to that, there had been an organization change here that had split the AFBMD, which had all of missiles and space, into 2 parts. One for missiles, ballistic missiles, which was called the Ballistic Systems Division, which was transferred out to Norton Air Force Base at San Bernardino. And the other part stayed behind here in Inglewood, the Space Systems Division. So by then I was the vice commander of Ballistic Systems Division and anticipating shortly becoming the commander, and had ambitions to move on through the command lines of what was still then ARDC, Air Research and Development Command. So to be transferred to a civilian organization and therefore think of it as being sidetracked from an Air Force career was at least one element in my reluctance to make the move. It turned out to be I should have viewed it as an opportunity that one would be excited to embrace, which it really was. And it turned out, of course, to be a good career move at the same time. You asked about the attitudes. I think the attitudes within NASA were mixed or guarded. A certain amount of natural reluctance and reluctance to embrace a complete outsider, especially with a uniform, into NASA, a very capable, very professionally capable organization. So there was reluctance and resistance. That didn't persist for very long, and it never was really very apparent. But you know, you could sense that at least there was guarded apprehension about whether this was going to be good.
What about the transition into a manned program from an unmanned ballistic system? The introduction of an element there, the astronaut corps, did that provide any challenges to you as the director?
Well, yes, very much. It introduced a whole new dimension to the progress of rocketry. It was certainly a known dimension in terms of aircraft and aeronautics, but rocketry to then had been thought of largely as a statistical probability measure of success. In other words, we'd target for, I don't remember the exact numbers, but 90% reliability for, say, Minuteman, meaning that 90% of those launched would wind up with their warheads on the target. That number probably is not exactly right, but the concept is what I'm describing. Well, in a manned environment, you can't accept a statistical approach to reliability or survivability. The approach has to be to design for success and to design against failure, and to design especially against failure that would involve crew loss or loss of life. So that brought the need into the rockets and all the equipment required, spacecraft and so on, for designing with larger safety margins, designing with redundant systems so that if one failed, another would be there to pick up and carry on the mission, to within the limits of what's possible, design against single point failures. All of those kinds of principles had then to be introduced into the design practices. It followed that a more extensive and comprehensive test program was judged to be required, and of course the need for extensive crew training and extensive equipping of all of the equipment for life support and for the many things that the crew members had to do, extravehicular and so on.
Did you see the program through to your satisfaction?
Very definitely. I was assigned there at the end of 1963. My understanding of my assignment, and my understanding derived from my conversations with General Curtis LeMay, who was Air Force Chief of Staff, and Secretary Zuckert, who was the Air Force Secretary at that time, was that the duration of my assignment would be until the mission was accomplished, which was to land men on the moon and get them back safely to Earth. So my understanding of my assignment was to carry out the landing. So that was done in July of '69 with Apollo 11. And shortly thereafter, I was ready to come back to an Air Force assignment. I might add that by then I had been promoted to Lieutenant General while on detached service, so my concerns about being sidelined and forgotten were groundless. I was promoted to Major General and then Lieutenant General while on detached service to NASA.
And those weren't the only rewards that you received as a result of the Apollo program, were they?
Well, no. The rewards of personal satisfaction with accomplishment were certainly major. Uh,
But you did return successfully to an Air Force career after that and came back to Los Angeles at the time. To what was it called then, the organization?
by then the organization here had been recombined, the missile and space activities, and it was called SAMSO, Space and Missile System Organization, which was a bit of a difficult name, but it really was the name of one of the major divisions of the Air Force Systems Command. We've kind of, if I could back up a minute,
Certainly.
we've kind of skipped over, or we have skipped over, one of the important organizational evolution steps of the Air Force. Remember that during the period that I was Minuteman Program Director in the 59 and early 60s, the Air Force was organized still with the Air Research and Development Command and the Air Materiel Command. Now, the organizational device that was used here in the missile and space early days of the space program to bridge that ARDC-AMC gap was to assign General Schriever as the commander of the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division the total mission. His job, as I understand it, was to be responsible for the development and the production and construction and work necessary to achieve an initial operational capability.
Now, that's not the way it was with the B-52 then, was it?
No, it's not. But that was a departure from the standard organizational structure, and it was facilitated by the assignment to General Schriever's organization of an element of Air Materiel Command's procurement organization, which was headed by General Ben Funk, and it was called the Ballistic Missile Office. So General Funk, with his procurement responsibilities, was assigned organizationally to work for General Schriever's Ballistic Missile Division while maintaining his needed connections with the Air Materiel Command. And so that was the organizational device that was put in place here to bridge that engineering procurement production gap. And that worked very effectively then at the program office level, where I headed, because my contracting people, my procurement production people, were headed by a Colonel Jim Foster, who, for all practical purposes, worked for me, although his organizational lines showed his connection with General Funk, as they should. And it worked very, very effectively. Now, that sequence of experience that I've described somewhat briefly, taken together with the companion experience going on at Wright Field in particular, made it clear to the upper levels of the Air Force leadership, that organizational improvements could be made. And at that time, General Schriever was the commander of the Air Research and Development Command by then. And so he really took the initiative in the Washington area and in working with his counterpart at the Air Materiel Command, General Sam Anderson, to highlight that problem of the engineering procurement production bridge. And the studies that were done resulted in decisions at the top of the Air Force to carve the procurement production responsibilities out of the Air Materiel Command, to assign them to what was still ARDC, and to rename both commands. And so that was the beginnings, and this was in the early 60s, of Air Force Systems Command, which had the total mission for the Air Force, starting with science and technology and going all the way through to acquisition and delivery of operational systems and equipment to the forces. And the Logistics Command then had the mission for the Air Force of all aspects of logistics support.
Training?
Yeah, well, not training, but equipment, depot, supply.
Bringing them online. And
Yeah, and then just to briefly complete that story, there comes a time in the acquisition of major systems where the job largely is field support. And at that point, the Air Force Systems Command is largely finished its acquisition job, and even though there may still be some small number of production units yet to come, that's passed over to the Logistics Command, and that occurred in the, it occurs in all the weapon systems, but I remember in particular the Minuteman, because it was in those early 60s that that step of creating the Systems Command was taken. And I think that was an essential step to sound management of the Air Force's technical and acquisition work.
So when you came to SAMSO, that whole transitional element had taken place, and you found an organization that was responsive to the needs of both ballistic missile development and space systems then?
Yes. Yeah, yes, the total responsibility for research, development, acquisition in ballistic missile and space systems was resided here. The programs of the time, this now being the early 70s, in the ballistic missile field, the Minuteman III was just in the latter stages of development and ready to be deployed operationally. The Minuteman III was a tremendous upgrade from the early Minuteman, with multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, larger payload capacity, greater accuracy. It was I think of it as a natural evolution, but it was a tremendous step. So that was a key program. The research and development work that ultimately led to the MX and the Peacekeeper was an important element of the work going on in the ballistic, in the missile part of the organization. Advanced reentry work was going on, and work interacting with the Army and their interests in ballistic missile defense technologies was proceeding with testing at Kwajalein, and we had important testing going on both the Pacific and the Atlantic ranges, and on the space side, the continuing development of the worldwide stations for tracking and data handling was an important element of our job. Those worldwide stations were, in the early years of the military space program, essential, and they still are, although in due time they will become less important as a relay from satellite vehicles develops. We were, one of our key programs on the space side was the development of the Titan III launch vehicle.
Heavy lifter.
Heavy lifter. The 3C, which used the trans stage and was largely for injection into high energy orbits, and the 3D, which came on the scene in that period, was the low Earth orbit, very heavy lifter, tens of thousands of pounds into low Earth orbit. The communication satellites were emerging, and the DISCUS, Defense Communication Satellite System, which ultimately was turned over to Defense Communications Agency for worldwide administrative traffic, was being launched in that period. The first of the Defense Support Program satellites was launched, and the ground station and networks that went with that, hooking it into both Cheyenne Mountain for defense and into Omaha for connection with SAC was going on. In parallel with all that, of course, were essential programs for special projects, the programs that commonly are known as the national means. And so it was a very exciting period of development of defense capabilities in space as well as in ballistic missiles.
Sounds like you were there at a very transitional time.
Yes.
And we need to transition now to another tape.
All right.